So last night, I'm going to get some snacks, and I walk past my little sister's room, and I hear my mum reading nursery rhymes as she does every night to send her off to sleep. But there was this one that caught my attention, and I'll read it out to you now. It goes, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. So far so good, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but keep listening. Jack came down and he'd earned £1, but Jill only had 3/4. So I burst in and I say, what are you doing? She says, oh, I'm just teaching her about the gender wage gap. I say 3 things. Firstly, the gender wage gap's 80p, not 75. Secondly, that isn't how the gender wage gap works. And thirdly, she's 2 years old. I mean, to be fair to my mum, it is so often misrepresented in this way. And many of you that have heard of it probably understand the wage gap to mean this. And some of you may never have even heard of it. Hopefully, in about 9 minutes' time, I'll have done a better job at explaining it than my mum did, and hopefully a worse job at sending you off to sleep. So funnily enough, the wage gap isn't as simple as a children's nursery rhyme, and there are actually many different factors contributing to it. So let's try and simplify it, and we'll continue to look at Jack and Jill. So often people confuse the gender wage gap and think that it means that when a man and a woman do the exact same job, such as fetching a pail of water, that the woman will earn 80p for every £1 the man earns. This is just not true. That is illegal. What this figure really means is that we have 5 Jacks and 5 Jills all doing completely different jobs. So we've got Chef Jill, Performer Jack, Astronaut Jill, Private Jack, and see if you can work the rest out. That if we sorted the Jacks by the amount that they earn, and then the Jills by the amount that they earn, Cheerleader Jill will earn 80p for every £1 Private Jack earns, because they're in the middle of their respective Jacks and Jills, making them the median average. Does this make sense? So the wage gap means the difference between the average earnings of men and the average earnings of women. This difference does seem to be falling, as we can see on this graph, with the wage gap on the vertical axis and the time in years on the horizontal axis. We also consider the entire workforce. If we only looked at full-time men and women, for example, women earn on average 92p for every £1 earned by men. Now I know this is a controversial and it's a complex topic, but it is also crucial for everyone to try to understand. Economists need to understand this, as we know wages are a useful incentive to get people to work harder. If in fact women are being unfairly paid a lower wage, we may be failing to motivate female workers to be at their most productive for our economy. For you personally, I'm sure you've heard politicians such as Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn push for equality in their political debates and manifestos. Here are 2 extracts of their 2017 manifestos. The Labour manifesto promised to take measures to close the gender pay gap, and the Conservative manifesto promised to tackle the gender pay gap. Large corporations are frequently introducing new policies to make their boardrooms and staff members more diverse and equal, and social media is rife with debate and theories surrounding the gender wage gap, and it can be so difficult to separate the facts from the fiction. This talk will lay the foundations for you to be able to understand the core factors at play in the gender wage gap, and decide for yourselves, once and for all, which policies to vote for, and also which tweets to retweet. It will come as no surprise to any parents watching this. Children are expensive. And from our research, it seems that having a child can also come at a great cost to a woman's earning potentials. However, it's clear to us that children are not the only factor at play here. This graph shows the gender wage gap in percentages on the vertical axis, and the time before and after the birth of their first child on the horizontal axis. And as you can see, women still earn around 10p less for every £1 earned by men prior to the baby being born. However, once the child is born, the gap almost immediately begins to rise and continues to rise, and 20 years later is closer to 30p. A 20p fall in this context is non-trivial. So why does it happen? There are a few important behavioural differences we can observe in the job market when a woman or a man has a baby. One such difference is that women are far more likely to leave the workforce after their first child. As you can see from these graphs, with the vertical axis showing the proportion of the female population in work, and the horizontal axis showing the time in years before and after the birth of their first baby, there is an immediate drop in the percentage of women in work for women of all education attainment levels, be it GCSE, A-level or degree, whereas the proportion of men in work is almost completely unaffected at all attainment levels. Another important thing to consider when we look at this graph is that even though the proportion of women in work begins to rise as their child gets older, there is always a lower proportion employed than men. Furthermore, if women do choose to stay in the workforce, they tend to reduce their hours and take up part-time work instead, which we assume is 25 hours or less per week. 4 in 10 first-time mothers will choose part-time work, compared to just 4 in 100 men. And women are more likely than men to stay in part-time work for the entire first 20 years of the child's life. From your own lives, you can probably see part-time jobs are often less well paid than full-time work, and research supports this observation, finding that part-time women earn 75p for every £1 full-time women earn. Not only does this lead to women on average earning less, these behaviours also lead to women on average accumulating 9 years less experience in full-time work and 5 years more experience in part-time work. Unfortunately, it's unlikely that the 5 years in part-time work will make up for much experience lost, as previous research suggests that only full-time work has the substantial benefit of workplace experience on earnings. The effect of this is felt most heavily by our female graduates, who after several years in the workplace would expect to see a 6% rise per year in her earnings, but would see none of this wage progression upon switching to part-time work. The loss of workplace experience is estimated to account for just under half of the gender wage gap, despite being a huge factor at play. See, I told you it wasn't easy. There also seems to be a difference between the genders when it comes to commuting behaviour. Men on average seem more willing to commute longer times. 1 in 4 women spend less than 30 minutes travelling to their place of work, compared to 1 in 3 men. People willing to commute longer times or distances are at an advantage when it comes to earning potential, because they are likely to have a wider pool of job opportunities to choose from, and in that pool, by the law of averages, they're more likely to have the choice of a high paying job. Much like the choice of hours worked, it seems that childbirth also has a huge influence on the choice of commuting time. As you can see from this graph showing time commuting on the vertical axis and years before and after the birth of their first child on the vertical axis, women almost immediately begin to reduce the amount of time taken to travel to and from work upon having their first child, whereas men, similar to employment, are largely unaffected. The similarities do not end there. Despite women increasing their commuting time as their child grows older, they still never commute for as long as men on average. So 9 minutes later, and Durex's stock is booming. None of you will want kids after this, but you should also have a greater understanding of the gender wage gap. The truth is, the gender wage gap does increase considerably after the birth of the first child, and we can guess at reasons as to why that may be. Whether that's right or wrong is for another day, but next time you hear about a potential policy aiming to tackle the gender pay gap, or you might even see a tweet with misinformed views on the gender wage gap, You should now be able to judge the policy at face value and use the tools I've given you today.